Jody's request. All right, so brief summary of the last 3 weeks. I know different people have been in and out to different classes, but we did, the idea was to do sort of a 4-week intro of sort of big topics in Jewish philosophy. First week we talked about individualism versus collectivism, so we talked about different visions of what the purpose of Judaism is. Visions of Judaism is really about perfection of the self. That can be religiously, morally, some sort of mystical communion, whatever that is, versus Judaism as a tool really for bettering the world, society, etc. So we talked about that sort of dichotomy of individualism versus collectivism. The second week, we talked about mysticism and rationalism, so sort of people who view whatever you thought the goal of Judaism was, and we covered a whole range of different ideas, but ways of viewing the tradition as achieving that in very sort of rational ways through using ritual as a grounds for moral training, creating society a certain way, like really rational arguments for how the tradition works, versus more mystical arguments about ways that religious action can have impacts on some sort of metaphysical, cosmological level that then changes the world. And last week we sort of covered a few thinkers who call them like anti-philosophers, or people who said really in our focus on the tradition we should not be looking for reasons. Our goal is really to live the religious life or the Jewish life without asking why, and sort of arguments for why we should be doing that and not asking why. Okay, so this week we're going to talk about the dichotomy of Judaism as a religion versus Judaism as a nation. So obviously to start talking about that we have to a degree kind of define the terms. And what I want to do is sort of give a bit of historical context. And I think the historical context, because one, I'm not a historian, and two, because we're going to do this in like this part in 3 or 4 minutes, is not going to be fully accurate. It's going to be very overgeneralized, but at least paints a picture that I think is very helpful. So until, let's say, the 1800s, until around the time of the French Revolution, Jewish communities and many religious communities were politically autonomous even within the societies they lived. So if you were a Jew in medieval Spain or medieval France, while you were subject to the rules of the country you lived in many ways your life was governed by the political rule of the Jewish community, meaning there were Jewish courts, religious leaders, etc., who actually had coercive authority, like police authority, and the state had relationships, the state, whatever it was at that time, right? The overarching governing body interacted, let's say, with the different communities. So they interacted with the Jewish community. They would take taxes from the community as a whole. But the community had political autonomy. So if you were a Jew in 17th century Spain or 16th century Spain, you weren't primarily a subject of the Spanish, I don't know, probably wasn't Spain then, right? I'm not a historian, but you weren't a subject of that broader authority. You were really a subject of the Jewish community. That was your province or your state, so to speak. And the Jewish community then was subject to the external power. What that meant is that being a Jew wasn't only a religious thing. It was your contract law, your civil law, your tax collection. Like, you existed as a Jew entirely, and even if you didn't, let's say, and again, there wasn't secularism until, let's say, the 17th century, but even if you were secular in terms of you didn't believe in anything religiously, you were a Jew because you had to be defined. Like, it's like if you live in America, you live in a state, right? Maybe you can live in a territory. You have to live in a state or a territory. There's nowhere else to live. If you lived in that context, you had to live as in a sub-community, in a Christian community, a Protestant community, a Catholic community, a Muslim community. So if you were a Jew, you lived in the Jewish community, and there was no separation between your religious and political identity. What happened in modernity and at different, I don't know if there's more, I think June has the sheets. But what happened in modernity in different ways at different times was, as an individual, you stopped becoming, when we separated religion and state, you stopped becoming subject to your community, and you were subject as an individual to the state. So the famous line, I don't remember who said it, but someone in the context of the French Revolution, contemporary with Napoleon, said, right, to the Jews, give to the Jew everything as a Frenchman or as an individual, but nothing as a Jew, meaning you're a citizen of the state, and I don't care what you are, I don't care if you're a Jew. It's not nothing as a Jew discriminate, it's I'm uninterested in you can be a Jew, a Catholic, I don't care. You're a citizen of the state. Each individual has a right. What that means, though, is that the meaning of your religious identity, and for our context, the Jewish identity, all of a sudden got split, right? Now all of a sudden we're an American, a Frenchman, a whatever, right, in your political role of life, and a Jew in your religious life. And all of a sudden that actually constrained this domain of life in which Judaism, so to speak, or being a Jew was relevant. And that had all sorts of impacts on Jewish philosophy. For a while, a lot of Jewish philosophers embraced that because of the freedoms that came with it, right? There was a lot of good in emancipation. But then there were also, over time, there were also a lot of Jewish philosophers who started to get scared. And even before that, even at the time, there were also a lot of Jewish thinkers who were scared of what emancipation meant for the narrowing of Jewish life. That's kind of the broader context that we're going to talk about. And we'll start with a few sort of sources about how we define that narrower sphere, what religion became sort of in modernity and how it narrowed. So the first source, and this is a throwaway, but it's a line that's used in a lot of these sort of philosophy around, political philosophy around separating religion and state. It's a line from the Gospel. Again, I don't know anything about the New Testament, but it's a line that's quoted all the time in this context of separating church and state. Right? Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Caesar, right, being the political leader, meaning there's things that are the domain of the political leader and are not the domain of God. And there's things that are the domain of God, of religion, and not the domain of the political leader. That's a non-obvious statement, right? If you were to read the Bible, the Tanakh, the Torah, like the 5 books of Moses, there isn't really a separation, meaning we have laws, our laws about the temple and sacrifices and holidays and civil law and, private law and damages. All of that is sort of melded together. There isn't a separate domain of religion or of gods and Caesars. So this is something new, or at least it's non-obvious. And one of the sort of most famous expressions of the separation. So I'm Canadian, but we're in America. So Thomas Jefferson, right, in the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, one of the earliest sort of expressions of separation in church and state. So he expresses the separation, the domain of religion versus domain of politics, and he gives an argument as to why it's important to separate religion from politics. So this is a statute, right? This is legislation from the late 1700s. It's an act for establishing religious freedom. Whereas Almighty God has created the mind free, that all attempts to influence it by temporal punishments or burdens or civil incapacitations tend only to beget habits of hypocrisy and meanness, and therefore a departure from the plan of the holy author of our religion, who being Lord both of body and mind, chose not to propagate it by coercion. So God created our minds free, and anytime people try to influence coercively our thought, right, try to tell us what we're allowed to believe and not believe, think of all sorts of religious inquisitions. Right? I think the history of America, you guys probably all know better than me, but Puritans fleeing religious oppression, being told what they have to believe and not believe in England, right? So Jefferson's saying whenever this happened, right, this led to hypocrisy and meanness. It was departure from the plan of God. Like bad things happened when we tried to coerce people into what they believed. That the impious presumption of legislators, rulers, civil as well as ecclesiastical, who being themselves fallible and uninspired men have received dominion over the faith of others, right? That it's an arrogance whenever sort of legislators, whether they're civil or ecclesiastical, whether they're religious authorities or secular civil authorities, whenever they've tried, these sort of fallible and imperfect men have tried to have dominion over the belief of others, right? Then they've led to false religions. They've had all sorts of deleterious effects. That to compel a man to furnish contributions of money for the propagation of opinions is sinful and tyrannical, right? To force people to contribute to state coffers that are then going to support specific religions is impious, is sinful. That even forcing him to support this or that, our civil rights have no dependence on our religious opinions, right? We should have civil rights independently of our religious opinions. And they should have no more impact on our opinions in physics or geometry, right? So our thoughts about religion should be equivalent or as relevant to our civil rights as our thoughts about math, right? No one says your rights in society are dependent on what you think about math or physics. Same thing with religion. And he goes on and on. So I don't know if we have to read it. It's worth reading because I think it is sort of impactful or sort of influential expression of the importance of separation of church and state. But he goes on to talk about how, right, on and on, how any time that civil secular authorities have tried to legislate religion, that has led to all sorts of untruths, and that the best way to actually get to truth and religious accuracy is to allow man's free mind, sort of a free market of religious ideas, let people debate and come and figure things out for themselves, and no coercion should be used in that. So he concludes, if we go to the end of this statute, therefore it should be enacted, right? So all of this is his sort of preface, and therefore the law is, it should be enacted by the General Assembly. No man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place or ministry whatsoever, nor shall be enforced, restrained, molested, or burthen in his body or goods, not on account of his religious opinions. There should be, right, religious opinion should have nothing to do with secular enforcement. All of this, so stepping back from this for a second, this I think to most of us seems like very obvious, and like, yeah, of course that's the case. But what I think is important to note here is he has a very specific conception of religion, right? His conception of religion really is primarily about getting to true beliefs, is knowing what is accurate and what is inaccurate. It's, if you guys remember, whoever was at the first class, we talked about Maimonides, right? For Maimonides, religion was all about getting to intellectual truth, knowing what's accurate or not. For others, that's not the case. It was about morals, it was about legislating society. Totally separating religion from society presumes that there's a domain that religion is interested in, which is a domain of, call it intellectual truth, true beliefs, accuracy in terms of there being a God or not, or what God wants from you, whatever. That's separate from the domain that politics is interested in, which is the legislation of interactions, let's say, between citizens. That's a huge assumption. And I think in Judaism, it's actually, if you just, again, read the Bible, it's a problematic assumption, because our Bible, the Old Testament, right, the 5 books, deals with many things that the state deals with. And so that's why I called sort of this first topic a Protestant conception of religion. And again, I'm no expert in Protestantism, but in traditions that are more focused on faith versus action, or where the realm of action is more prescribed, it is much easier to separate religious life from secular life. So there's the separation of religion and state presumes a very specific understanding of what religion is, right? Which is that it governs a certain domain that's separate from what politics governs. I'm not here to advocate, therefore, we need a theocracy. But I'm here to present a certain problem, which is I think that we all presume, and I think I agree with this presumption that it's important to have separation of church and state, but there's a problem underlying it, which is, okay, then what does that mean that religion can only operate in a narrow box? And what does religion have to say, or what's its appropriate role in domains where actually we do believe in political coercion, like legislating certain types of interactions between citizens? And I'll give, before we get into some of the Jewish philosophy, I'll give one really interesting example where this gets problematic. So the third source, this was a Supreme Court case in the UK from 15 years ago. The Jewish Free School, which I believe is an Orthodox school in London, had an applicant who under traditional Orthodox law, for a person to be Jewish, it goes by matrilineal descent in the Orthodox community, which means that if the mom has to be Jewish in order for the kid to be Jewish. Okay, so a student applies to the school. Mom isn't Jewish, has undergone a conservative conversion, where regardless of whether you think that should be accepted or not the issue here. There's the Orthodox community said we don't accept that conversion, and so this applicant isn't Jewish, and they excluded the applicant from the school. Right? And we can make an easier case. We don't get into politics of Orthodox conservative reform. Let's say because the court's analysis would have been the same if it was a non-Jewish, let's say non-Jewish father, mother, whichever one non-Jewish parent, use patrilineal descent or matrilineal, whatever it is, under your definition of Judaism, this student didn't meet it. And the family brought a lawsuit for religious discrimination, right? Saying for ethnic discrimination, you're discriminating. The schools have, and I don't know enough about the UK legal system, but there is freedom for schools to operate and to exclude based on religious criteria, but you can't exclude based on ethnic criteria. So the family brought a lawsuit saying this is discrimination based on ethnicity. It's based on my descent. It's not based on my religion. The court concluded 5-4. And this is a small quote. It's a long decision. This is a small quote from the judge who wrote from the majority. It says, I do not accept that they were not considering the applicant's ethnic origins or making a decision on ethnic grounds. As I see it, once it's accepted that the reason M is not a member of the Jewish religion is that his forebears in the matrilineal line were not Orthodox Jews, and that in that sense his less favorable treatment is determined by his descent, it follows that he's discriminated against on ethnic grounds. The question is, in my opinion, whether it's discrimination on ethnic grounds to discriminate against all those who are not descended from Jewish women. We have a problem in that the conception of religion in England is, right, in its core and still officially a Protestant country. There's an understanding of religion that's fundamentally faith-based, right? So to being a Christian, in my understanding, and I might be wrong, and I think for certain sects you have to be baptized or not, but is more, I think, when someone says I'm a Christian, my understanding is that it's more of a statement regarding faith. Whereas if someone says I'm a Jew, you can say I'm a Jew and I don't believe anything, right? And I don't think it would be the case. And again, I might be wrong, but my understanding is it wouldn't be the case that you would say, I am a Christian if you don't believe, even if you're born to Christian parents. That's not the case in Judaism, right? We derive being Jewish, whether you're Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, secular, whatever, we derive being Jewish from descent. That doesn't fit with the neat attempt to divide church, state, nation, ethnicity from religion as a sort of profession of faith. So this sort of separation is problematic for Jews, right? We talked about it a bit sort of like theologically, what does religion mean? Does religion govern other matters? Now we're talking about here's a very practical, Supreme Court decision where the court said Jewish school can't use this criteria, right? It's sort of where rubber does hit the road. Okay, that's sort of the introduction. Section B is going to be a very, very short section, sort of a summary, and we'll talk about it. Then we'll get into section C, which are Jewish thinkers who say Judaism is not, we can't separate religion from state, so to speak. So the next source from a book called How Judaism Became a Religion. It's sort of an intellectual history of modern Jewish philosophy. And it's called How Judaism Became a Religion because basically the argument is this religion as a separate concept, independent of ethnicity, state, except independent of a broader, more all-encompassing identity, is a creation of modernity. It is a creation really of post-emancipation times where people are individuals or citizens of their states as individuals and of nations as individuals, and then their religion is a thing they choose in terms of their faith. So she writes this sort of a summary, and we'll talk about it a bit more. She writes, German thought ends where it begins, German Jewish thought, with the tensions between affirming the communal, indeed public character of Jewish life, law, and experience. So she writes a whole summary of Jewish German thought, including Reform, Orthodox, Conservative, like a wide range of Jewish German thinkers. And all of them, on the one hand, confirm the public character of Jewish life, law, and experience, while at the same time denying this public character is in any way in conflict with the public character of the modern nation state. Right? Modern Jewish philosophers face a problem. They're told for the first time, hey, you're a member of society. But to be a member of society, all sorts of things they used to do, they can't do. They don't have the same type of communal authority. You can't enforce private law. You can't enforce Jewish law over the community. There's no more communal authority because the authority is given to the state. That's what it means to say every Jew is now a free member of the state, is that the rabbinic court can't now come and coerce things on you. So these modern Jewish philosophers faced a problem where they said, on the one hand, this is great, or some of them said this is great, right? But on the one hand, there's this opportunity to have freedom and to stop being discriminated against. On the other hand, there's a loss to the political authority and the political community. So on the one hand, they wouldn't deny that Judaism had law and a public character, but they said, no, it doesn't conflict. Like, don't worry, basically. We can be American and Jewish. It works, right? From Mendelssohn to Rosenzweig, German Jewish thinkers argue that Judaism is not a religion like Protestantism because it's a religion of law, right? So on the one hand, they have to say it's not just faith. Like, they can't deny the history of Judaism, which is it's a religion of law, and it's not just a religion like Jefferson was talking about of like true opinions. Yet these same thinkers describe Judaism despite themselves precisely as religion in a Protestant sense because they also contend that Judaism is a realm of life entirely different and therefore entirely compatible with the modern nation state. So we're not going to go into all the philosophers she's describing because that's not what I want to focus on now, but just as sort of a variety of examples, she talks about Abraham Geiger, who's sort of the intellectual founder of the Reform movement, who he largely dismisses ritual law, and he focuses as the true core of Judaism is its ethical law, its ethical monotheism, and the impact of the way the belief in one God, sort of how you derive from that certain type of ethics. But it's not coercive, and it doesn't. Again, you can be a religious Jew, which means you believe in ethical monotheism, and your understanding of God impacts your ethics and sort of teaches your ethics. And Judaism teaches that to the world, but it has no impact on our being able to be a modern citizen. Same thing on the Orthodox side. She talks about Moses Mendelssohn. So Mendelssohn is people in the Orthodox world often describe Mendelssohn as sort of a precursor of Reform. But Mendelssohn himself was actually, I think, thought he was defending an Orthodox conception of Judaism. And he basically said Judaism is entirely a religion of law, but it's non-coercive. I mean, we don't enforce it. Samson Raphael Hirsch is another German rabbi who definitely very much was sort of one of the fathers of German Orthodoxy, modern Orthodoxy, arguably, said, again, the law is entirely mandatory on the Jew, but we don't ritual law, we don't coerce it, right? They wanted to enable Jews to live in the modern state and say what we're doing doesn't conflict, but not deny the whole history of Jewish law, but all of a sudden Jews were free to do it or not do it. By the way, like 200 years before that, you would be excommunicated in most Jewish communities if you didn't obey the law, right? It's a radical switch that happened. And that's most of the Jewish communities that we interact with and think about are working under this model, right? Even the most, this is probably not true in certain Hasidic communities, but for the most part, you wouldn't be excommunicated or kicked out. No one would try to use a coercive mechanism if you didn't obey the Jewish law. You would still live within that community. If you didn't keep kosher in your house, someone might decide they don't eat at your house, but no one's going to try to coerce that. And that was not, and it's important to know that wasn't the case, right? That wasn't the case up until more recently. You would be up until more recently, the last couple hundred years, up until the emancipation. You would be excommunicated. You would be kicked out of the community, and there was no secular society to be part of, right? If you're kicked out of the community, you either had to convert to Christianity or you were nowhere, right? You were alone. So most Jewish philosophers, Jewish communities we interact with work under this assumption. And now what I want to do is read a whole bunch of sources of different thinkers who sort of say this assumption of separating Judaism as a religion that's separate from the state doesn't really work in terms of what Judaism is meant to be. We're not going to get to any conclusion with this. The idea is just to sort of share some of the problems with our modern sort of, I think what often we take for granted as sort of these separate domains. So the first source is from Maimonides' Mishnah Torah, which is his sort of code of halakha, of Jewish law. And here he codifies something from the Talmud about a prohibition of going to secular courts. So he writes, when any person, we're in the third page, see source 5. When any person has a judgment adjudicated by Gentile judges in their courts, he's considered a wicked person. It's as if he has disgraced, blasphemed, and lifted up his hand against the Torah of Moses, our teacher. This applies even if their laws are the same as the laws of the Jewish people, right? Literally, if the code of law is identical, if you go and get adjudicated in the secular court as opposed to the Jewish court, you're rebelling against the tradition and against our people. This is indicated by Exodus 21:1. These are the judgments you shall place before them and not Gentiles. That's how the Talmud derives it from the verse. Before them, not before ordinary people. Basically, they derive from the Bible, from the Torah, that you have to go, that when you get your dispute settled, you have to do it before a Jewish court. The following procedure should be carried out if the Gentiles have a powerful law enforcement system and the opposing litigant is a stubborn and powerful person from whom one cannot expropriate property through judicial system to the Jewish people. Okay, here he says, what if the other litigant refuses to go to the Jewish court? What do? Side point. There's obviously a tremendous concern with going to non-Jewish courts, right? He doesn't just say, oh, this is prohibited, right? It's as if you disgraced, blasphemed, lifted up your hands against the Torah of Moses, our teacher. Like, why is this such a big deal? So again, I want to give a bit of context to help understand this. So, and this is a quote that stuck with me, and I cannot remember I remember where I read it. I don't remember who it's from. So there's a book called Mishpat Ivri, which literally means Hebrew law, by a former president of the Israeli Supreme Court named Menachem Alon, who is also an incredible halachic scholar of Jewish law. And he has this whole compendium of the history of Jewish law. And he writes about this Italian rabbi, who I can't remember who it was, who says basically at the time of emancipation, right? So we talked about emancipation in the beginning. One of the big things that happened in emancipation is if the Jew is no longer subject to the autonomy of the Jewish community, if he had a dispute, he could go to a secular court, which we see from Maimonides, a lot of rabbinic authorities were extremely concerned about. He says, if this is what happens and Jews start functioning under secular law for their day-to-day matters, he basically says, and I'm summarizing, so I don't remember the words, but something along the lines of, all we'll have left is like the holidays and the ritual law. We won't have like the real meat of the tradition. What he was saying is the meat of our tradition was actually our secular law, our laws governing contracts, torts, business engagements, governing day-to-day life. And Menachem Alon, the author of this book, describes how if you look back at rabbinic responsa, rabbinic halachic legal literature up until the time of emancipation, so up until, say, the late 1700s, early 1800s, the predominance of the literature, like by pages, is about matters we would consider secular. Is rabbis adjudicating, based on Jewish law, issues of commercial issues, private issues, all sorts of issues that nowadays we would go to secular courts. That was what it meant to be a Jew, was to live within a Jewish legal system. And again, this wasn't about coercing you to keep Shabbat or keep kosher. It was actually about a Jewish system of law and encompassing Jewish way of life. What Maimonides is saying is, what's the issue if you start going to secular court? It's not even that our law is more just, right? He says, it doesn't even matter if the secular law is the exact same law. Like the code can say the same things. It's about living within a Jewish encompassing legal system, but more than just what we call a religion. And so nowadays we're used to there, and it's not uncommon in certain parts of the Orthodox world to take commercial disputes still to a Jewish court. But I would say in the Jewish world generally, it's definitely predominantly secular, what we call secular disputes are governed under secular law. And religious matters are governed under religious law. And that's true in most parts, I would say, of the Jewish community, if not all of them. And one of the things, and going along with this book from Menachem Elon, from that Justice of the Supreme Court, there was a movement when the State of Israel was established to try to bring, so what happened, emancipation happened, and Jewish private law, Jewish secular law, kind of stopped. It didn't stop developing entirely, but how does law develop? When people bring cases, right? It doesn't develop in a vacuum. So intellectual property law develops because of patents and inventions, and things happen, and judges have to make decisions, and legislators respond, and now you have laws around AI because people are being forced to respond. Is there good halakha, Jewish law around AI? There could be. There's probably not a lot of material or cases being brought to Jewish courts or brought to Jewish authorities, so the literature isn't developing. So when the State of Israel was established, there was a movement called the Mishpat Ivri movement, a sort of Hebrew law movement of saying, putting aside the ritual stuff, because we're not going to enforce that coercively in the Jewish state, but let's try to actually bring Jewish private law that is a good legal system, and let's try to actually use it in the state. The issue they ran into, or one of the issues, was this gap since emancipation till the establishment of the state of 200-300 years, where it hadn't developed sufficiently because there just wasn't enough material brought. And there's a bit of, if you call from the perspective of Jewish law, there's a tragedy there, right? That the fact emancipation caused a pause in the actual development of the resources. So here you see
precedent, basically.
Yeah, precedent didn't develop. If no one ever brought a case, if you have a country where there's no technology, I don't know, I imagine there's certain countries where there's very little development, and so their patent law is just not sophisticated because there's just not cases brought to the court, and so legislators aren't pressured to legislate. Law gets made in response to life, right? So if life isn't brought before the people who make law, the legislators and the judges, then law won't develop effectively. So the importance of bringing, what Maimonides is saying is, and there were a lot of rabbis at the time of emancipation, and more in the Orthodox world. There probably really was only an Orthodox world at the time of emancipation, or what we now call Orthodox. There was only a more traditional world. They were very, very nervous about emancipation. They said, we're going to lose our political. If you're cynical, you'd say, rabbis are upset they're going to lose their authority. And if you're not cynical, you'd say they were actually concerned about the loss of the flourishing of Jewish life as a comprehensive way of life and not something that's just relegated to what we talked about at the beginning, this narrow domain of religion. And when Maimonides is saying we have to go to Jewish courts, if we don't go to Jewish courts, we lose what for many rabbis until the 18th century was the crux of Jewish life, which was Jewish life governing day-to-day matters. And we've lost that for the most part. I don't want to say it's impossible in certain communities, and there is still Batei Din, Jewish courts do still deal with commercial disputes. But I'd say in the broader part of the Jewish world, a price we've paid for emancipation is we have largely lost that. For good and for bad, I'm not trying to say we should go to a theocracy, but this is just part of what comes with it, right? So that's one source of sort of one of the problems that comes with this separation of church and state. One of the challenges, at least in terms of Judaism, is we've narrowed the sort of practical application of our religion. By the way, one last thing I'll say before we go to the next source is what has happened instead of that is that the study of Jewish law, let's call it secular law, Jewish law as it applies to mundane secular matters, is it's become a theoretical pursuit. So we talked, I think earlier, in the second class, we talked about the yeshiva world a bit, and the ultra-Orthodox yeshiva world, and even not the ultra-Orthodox, the modern Orthodox yeshiva world as well. There's a tremendous focus on the study of the Talmud and of Jewish law. And in many places, not all places, but in many of it, the study of Jewish law is idealized as a theoretical study. I mean, it's a study for its own sake, where you're studying the law as this divine will that actually we're not even talking really about applying it. The study of it theoretically is its own beauty. And there may be a beauty in that. Part of that is because there's a loss of the applicable side, right? Once Jewish courts stopped really dealing all the time, and Jewish scholars stopped having to deal all the time with the practical implications of the Jewish law and secular matters, it sort of evolved into, so what do we do with this massive corpus of Jewish text, right? This massive corpus in our tradition, that's incredibly sophisticated and beautiful and wonderful. Well, we no longer had a way to apply it, so it became saying, oh, studying it has some sort of theological, metaphysical, religious, spiritual value that's totally divorced from reality. But there's a law, I think, in my opinion, that's really a loss. Really the point of that law was actually to govern day-to-day life and to actually address day-to-day life. And instead it turned into this sort of, this abstract, separated theoretical world. So that's one sort of problem that comes from the separation. Now let's go to a very, very non-orthodox source, so Mordechai Kaplan, who's seen as the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism. His famous book, his sort of magnum opus that's seen as like the founding...
Can you just briefly Reconstructionist?
I can't because I'm not educated enough on the matter. Reconstruction, I mean, I've read his book, but I don't know what it evolved. Well, this source is really, we'll talk about this source, and that's sort of as much as I know about Reconstructionist Judaism.
Is that a...
Oh, it's a movement. It's largely only exists in America, though it's expanded a bit. It's like if you talk about the three sort of movements that most people talk about, let's say Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform, Reconstructionist would be a fourth.
Oh,
fourth
okay.
Yeah, sorry, would be a fourth
Okay.
movement. Founded by Mordechai Kaplan was, I think he escaped Europe. Before the war came, he taught it. He was the dean, I don't remember dean of what, but he was a dean at JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary, which is the sort of central academy of conservative Judaism.
Just out of curiosity, does anyone here know how many actual sects of Judaism there are? Is that something that's counted?
I was thinking 3 before I heard about Reconstructionist, but
I think it's like, I don't. There is no way to answer that because it depends how granular you want to get. It's like if we said I don't know how many kinds of couches are there. It's like, well, we can divide them into love seats and I don't know anything about couches, right? But you can subdivide as much as you want, right? You can say, well, there's leather and this and so I think the Orthodox, Conservative, Reform is just the easiest sort of way that most people talk about it, and because each of those communities has, let's say at least in America, has very institutionalized bodies. So institutions will often affiliate, like a synagogue might affiliate with the broader institutional body of Reform Judaism or Conservative Judaism, or so yeah.
We only have
that's
an
a
hour,
fifth class.
so
Yeah.
we only have
Yeah. But I would say that's
interesting.
I would say
though.
that's
It is
the
interesting.
easiest.
Right.
That's the easiest is Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, but within each one of those you'll have
Yeah,
tremendous
within each
diversity.
one, yeah.
And then Reconstructionist would be a fourth. That's mostly in America, but maybe in some other
I have
places.
never met a Reconstructionist.
No,
guess
I met
just
one
haven't sought
Reconstructionist.
after,
friend.
just passed
more definitions.
I think there is in Salt Lake
No,
City.
there's
There's
Jews for
Reconstructionist
Jesus,
communities.
too.
Well,
Right. So
I'm
whether
just- I'm-
so
I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
right. So I think there you'd have a lot of Jews who would argue that that's not. I'm not. Yeah. That would.
Not really.
What falls
that
in and
wasn't
out the
also
camp
used.
depends who you ask.
I
Right.
love the couch metaphor. That's fabulous.
Okay, so Mordechai Kaplan is the father of Reconstructionist Judaism, and his magnum opus, or his book that's called the philosophy book of Reconstructionist Judaism, is called Judaism as Civilization, and it basically says what the title says, which is Judaism as a civilization. Right, but as a quote, Judaism as civilization is not a form of truth, meaning it's not a philosophical position, right? If I said, I don't know, let's pick a civilization, right? Rome, or I don't know, I think America at this point is probably a civilization. America doesn't have one truth, right? Depending who you talk to in America on different political sides, they'll say very different things. It is still a civilization, whether it's still comprehensive and whether it's too divided, I don't know, but it's a civilization. It doesn't have one truth. So Mordechai Kaplan says Judaism as civilization is not a form of truth, but a form of life. The higher the organism is in the scale of life, the more intricate and complex its structure, right? So once he's comparing it to life and not a form of truth, as a living organism gets as it's higher in the scale of life, and more sophisticated organisms are much more complex. To survive, Judaism must become complex. Those who look to Judaism in its present state to provide them with a ready-made scheme of salvation in this world or in the next are bound to be disappointed. If you're looking for an answer, say, what does Judaism say about X? He's saying, bad question. He's saying, I think, bad question. Judaism is complex. There will be different positions, different understandings. It's a civilization. It's like saying, what does America say? What does America say about redistribution of wealth? Right? Anyone who gives you a one-line answer to that is lying, right? There's a lot of different things that America and Americans say America has to say about redistribution of wealth. right, so it doesn't provide you with any sort of ready-made scheme of salvation, with any ready-made, here's what you do to get salvation, whether it's in this world to create the perfect society or for some, some life in the next world. The Jew will have to save Judaism before Judaism will be in a position to save the Jew. He must rediscover, reinterpret, reconstruct the civilization of his people. To do that, he must be willing to live up to a program that spells nothing less than a maximum of Jewishness. Judaism is something that as a civilization we continue to create and develop. Civilization is what we continue to do with it. That doesn't take a position on whether, if you think America is divinely blessed or not. There are Americans who think America is divinely blessed and Americans who think America is very much not divinely blessed, right? You can take both those positions and be in the American civilization. It's a project you're in together. That is what Jewish civilization is. That is what Judaism is. It's all part of that project that we are continuing to develop together. That is not something that, I don't know that's, now Mordechai Kaplan very much thought this could exist within America, that it didn't have to contradict being a member of a secular or somewhat secular state. But it definitely expands what Judaism has to say beyond the sort of narrow realm of what we defined as sort of religion at the beginning. Point there being, it's not only a sort of orthodox perspective of Jewish law that says Judaism is much bigger than a narrow realm of religion. This claim can come from the far left of Judaism and the far right of Judaism. Next source, a very different example, Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Kook. So this is what's called a very different realm of Orthodox. He's an Orthodox rabbi, but as opposed very much a very Israeli Orthodox rabbi. His father, Avram Isaac Kook, is seen as one of the fathers of religious Zionism. His son, Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook, rabbi. His father was sort of more, I don't want to say inclusive, but was more broad in his outlook on politics. He died before the founding of the state and sort of had a very, very positive relationship with, he saw the secular Zionism as sort of a very important piece of sort of the Jewish project and the Jewish salvation. Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook was more sectarian, I guess it's fair to say. He was more politically involved and politically not inclusive. He was very much politically on a certain camp, very much on a right-wing camp. Saw, the goal, especially after the 6-Day War and after the conquering of Jerusalem, saw the future of Jewish life and Jewish salvation as being about creating Jewish sovereignty over the land of Israel, over the biblical land of Israel, and any attempt of a secular state to undermine that sovereignty he saw as really impeding God's plan. And looking at the different players in Israeli politics now, understanding that theological position is important because that has a voice now in the Israeli government. And again, here's a vision. We'll read one of the sources of his, but here's a vision of what Jewish life is that is not just about religious faith. It's actually about, one, it's very much focused on the state of Israel, or the Jewish people's autonomy in Israel. And Jewish salvation is dependent on Jewish autonomy and governance over a particular piece of land. That is, whether you agree with that or not, that debate is far beyond the scope of religious faith and what do you believe, is there a God, is there a God and not, and do you observe Shabbat or kosher, what does it mean to observe Shabbat or kosher, right? This is about Jewish project and salvation is about political autonomy, political control, and to a degree Jewish legal governance over a territory, right? So, and he writes in writing about the Holocaust, he writes, the Jewish people have been brought here, severed from the depths of exile, to come to the state of Israel. The blood of the 6 million represents a substantial excision for the body of the nation. God's people had clung so determinedly to the impurity of foreign lands that when the end time arrived, they had to be cut away with the great shedding of blood. Basically, the Holocaust happened, and again, we talked a bit in one of the classes about Holocaust theology. Maybe we'll do a separate independent class on that, but the Holocaust happened because Jews wouldn't leave. Jews wouldn't get out of America, wouldn't get out of Europe, but basically Jews had to be in Israel. The Jewish salvation is Jewish governance and autonomy over the land of Israel, the Jewish people being there. Jews wouldn't leave, so God had to rip them out, right? Again, whether you think that's a good argument or not, put to the side. Right, the end time arrived, the Messianic era had arrived. By the way, this may sound crazy to us, especially with going on now. They're in a Messianic era. Post 6-Day War, this was a pretty common position. There was a euphoria post 6-Day War of we've reached an end of Jewish history. There's autonomy, there's safety, there's miraculous victory, right? This wasn't a year-and-a-half war, an ending war like we're in now. This was 6 days and it's over and everything worked, So it was a very different time. But this cruel excision reveals our real life, the rebirth of the nation and the land, the rebirth of the Torah, all that is holy. These historical, cosmological, divine facts must be seen as such, seeing this as more than understanding, it's encounter with the master of the universe. To think that you can have Judaism as this sort of thing that exists in the synagogue and in ritual practice, and then you have your secular civil life in a society outside of a comprehensive Jewish society governing the land of Israel is a joke to him. It's like a fragment of what the tradition is. I'm not making any comment on whether, where Judaism should be, but like understanding that this conception of separating, we talked about at the beginning, of separating the realm of the religion from the realm of the state, and religion forming a very important part of a spiritual, intellectual, moral part of life, and then you have the secular part of life. This sort of separation and sort of setup or structure for religion and state and society that was created in the 17th, 18th century. There's a lot of things in Judaism where this doesn't necessarily work, and it's just not so clean, right? Now, eighth source, our last source that we'll go through today, our second last source, sorry, is Eliezer Berkovitz. So we talked about Eliezer Berkovitz in, I think, the first two classes. Very, very brief summary again, right? Eliezer Berkovitz saw the point of Jewish life, of all of Judaism, really, as being a model for what it means for a moral and righteous society and having an impact on the world to create a better and more righteous world. All of ritual as well was targeted to create that more moral world. Ritual is a practice, really practice for morality. Important practice, not one that he thought you could neglect, but was practice for morality, which was the pinnacle. And he was exceptionally Zionist, not because he saw, like Tzvi Yehuda Kook, a sort of more mystical vision, because he said, if you're going to have an impact on the world stage and be a model, you can't do that in individual communities. You also need the vehicle of a state. You need to be an actor on the world stage in order to have that impact, that positive impact on the world. So very practically, that's why you need a state in order for Jews to accomplish what Judaism is about. So this is from an essay about him. Berkovitz argues Judaism has always understood its central mission to be the creation of an exemplary community and not just exemplary individuals, not the education of holy individuals, but the existence of a holy people constitutes Judaism's central contribution to establishing morality in the world. This understanding of Judaism finds expressions throughout his writings. In his extensive works on Jewish law, he argues law must be understood not just as a code for individual piety, but as a system which combines the devotional with the political, right? If Judaism is a civilization, tradition, people that is meant to embody and impact what is good and right in the world, it has to speak to politics. If it confines itself to what we call that realm of religion, then it's just not going to have that impact. It has to speak to politics. It has to speak to what moral warfare is. It has to speak to all the real issues that the world deals with. It's hard to do that. It's hard to do that even if you're in an impactful community. It's hard to do that without also having a state on the world stage, right? And so here again, separating religion and state. Now, Berkovitz didn't argue for theocratic rule in terms of enforcing religious law in certain ways in the state of Israel, but he said we have to be taking what the Jewish tradition has to say about political matters into how we build this state, because that's the whole point, right? Now that can happen in a way that's sort of, in my opinion, and some people's opinion might be very negative in terms of enforcing all sorts of ritual things, issues around rabbinate and marriage and all those sort of issues now that exist in the state of Israel, where certain ritual things are enforced and people are excluded, whatever. But that's one realm where the impact can happen and can have certain types of impacts that some people might see as very deleterious. But if you think the Jewish tradition has something to say about all these secular, mundane matters we talked about ethics, of the way legal systems developed in warfare and politics, etc., then if the Jewish state if the whole goal of the Jewish people is to have this certain impact on the world, and the Jewish state is either the primary, or at least a very extremely important, one of the primary methods in which the Jewish people has that impact, to say we don't want the Jewish tradition to impact the way that state acts, well, it sort of defeats the whole purpose. We might as well then not have the state, right? So again, the separation starts being very problematic. And now I want to bring one last source, and then we can have time to talk. We'll have time if there's any questions or other issues we want to talk about. But I want to bring again a secular Zionist source, because I don't want to, it's not this understanding of the Jewish tradition as being not able to be confined to the religious realm is not, and it's something I'm trying to emphasize, but is not only an Orthodox conception of saying, hey, let's enforce Orthodox rule. So Achad Ha'am, who is one of probably the spokesman or thinker for cultural Zionism, secular cultural Zionism, in the late 19th century, early 20th century. So he writes. So these are two pieces from two different essays of his. One, he's talking about emancipation that we talked about at the beginning, right? Do I envy these fellow Jews of mine their emancipation? Remember, this is a secular cultural Jew. I answer in all truth and sincerity, no, 1,000 times no, right? I do not. So he's in Russia. He's not emancipated, right? So he's living under Russian rule, and he's looking at the Jews in the Western Europe who have emancipation, free rights. He's saying, I don't envy them. Why? I have at least not sold my soul for emancipation. I at least know why I remain a Jew, or rather I can find no meaning in such a question, any more than if I were asked why I remain my father's son. So those German Jewish philosophers we talked about before, right? Jews are liberated. They're no longer governed by the Jewish community. Now they have a question, like, okay, what does it mean to be a Jew? Like, why? Like, what is Judaism? What am I doing? A question I think many people have, right? He says, I pity their emancipation because they are now faced with this dilemma that a Jew shouldn't be faced with. A Jew just is a Jew. Right? So it's like asking, why am I my father's son? He's living in Russia where he doesn't have a choice to not be a Jew, right? He's a Jew because the Tsar says he's a Jew, and he's subject to if the Tsar is going to draft a certain percentage of Jews into the army, he's in the pool, right? So he's got to deal with part of the Jewish community whose kids are being drafted by the Tsar. Like, he can't opt out. There's no choice. So he can't opt out because he's politically coerced in a terrible, in an oppressive Russian Empire. But he's saying, I would rather that where it is clear who I am than have these struggles of an emancipated free Jew. Right? Again, I don't know if I would agree or not agree with say which one would you rather, but a powerful point about what it means to be a Jew and sort of the problems of being a Jew in a free world. So that's one piece, and then his piece on a small piece of his on Zionism, on sort of the Jewish nationalism. So Judaism needs at present but little. It needs not an independent state. Okay, so this is part of an internal Zionist debate about whether Jews need a state or just need a concentration of Jews in the land but not a state. Right? So it needs not an independent state but only the creation in its native land of conditions favorable to its development. A good-sized settlement of Jews working without hindrance in every branch of culture, from agriculture and handicrafts to science and literature, right? Meaning these are all four items that I would say in America, Judaism probably has very little to say as Judaism about agriculture, handicrafts, science, and literature. And there might be a lot of Jews who are impactful in a lot of those domains. But if you were to go to a synagogue and ask the rabbi of the synagogue, what do you have to say about agriculture, handicrafts, science, and literature? Their answer would be more limited, or that wouldn't be their focus, right? Whereas he's saying this is what Judaism has to talk about life, about everything. This Jewish settlement, which will be a gradual growth, will become in the course of time the center of the nation, where its spirit will find pure expression and develop in all its aspects up to the highest degree of perfection it's capable. His vision of Zionism, right, this is his expression of cultural Zionism, is a center from which a concentrated core of the Jewish people can from there can flourish a Jewish perspective and development and understanding of everything, not just of religion, right, of everything, of economy, of everything. Then from this center, the spirit of Judaism will go forth to the great circumference, to all the communities of the diaspora, and will breathe new life into them and preserve their unity. And when our national culture in Palestine has attained that level, we may be confident it will produce men in the country who will be able, on a favorable opportunity, to establish a state which will be a truly Jewish state and not merely a state of the Jews. So he goes on to say, we don't need a state yet. We need a cultural center that will evolve, and then we'll be able to build what's not just so. This was an internal debate between Herzl and Chadam. Herzl was also a secular Zionist, but not a cultural Zionist, and Herzl just thought Jews couldn't survive outside because we're oppressed. We just need a place where we can be like everybody else, not different. We just need our own state that's just like the America of Jews. And he wasn't particularly interested in Judaism. Chadam, who is secular, but deeply interested in Judaism, says says we'll get to a state. What we need to revive Judaism, we need a center where the Jewish population concentrates. There will be diaspora around as well, but we need a core where we'll develop Jewish everything, Jewish economy, Jewish agriculture, Jewish science, where we develop what it means to be a Jew, what Judaism has to say about everything, and that can then influence the world. And then we can build not just a state of the Jews, a state where Jews can survive, which might be important, right? Especially now we see maybe we really do need somewhere just where we can escape to, but that also is a Jewish state, right? And he's saying a Jewish state not theocratically at all, because he doesn't have any theological commitments, but that where Judaism speaks to everything. So again, sort of to sum up, we started with saying emancipation created this sort of separation. What free societies did was create this separation of religion. There's religious freedom in your religious, spiritual, intellectual, whatever life. Everyone can do whatever they want, and the state governs secular matters. And for the most part, that's good. That's gotten rid of a lot of problems of not trying to I'm not trying to poo-poo that, right? That's a fantastic thing. It creates a challenge for Judaism specifically, I think, because our tradition clearly, going back to its core and reading its core text, is trying to speak to all of life. And so the challenge that creates is and that challenge it's problematic in Israel too, because there's debates, but let's say to speak here to in American or diaspora Judaism, what does it mean to say Judaism really does speak to all of life? And how do we work with that, and how do we understand what it means to live as a Jew in a place where we still want to keep secular life separate, meaning we don't want to we like religious freedom. I don't think people want to create like religious autonomy. The rabbi or synagogue sort of governs everything you do in your life. But I think we would want to argue that Judaism should be speaking to a much broader realm of our life, or much broader realm of society, not just in personal life, that has something to say there. And so the idea here was just to bring the challenge of Judaism as a religion, a people, something more.
This reminds me of something a big Jewish thinker in Jewish history said, which is that I'm not sure what's worse, Nazi Germany or the friendliness of America.
Right, and that's in a
Because
way
the
exactly what
friendliness
Haram said. Right?
Yeah, because the friendliness of America causes people to forget who they are as a person, their identity, and that's the worst kind of exile. That's the worst kind of pain that a person could be in when they're not in touch with themselves.
I think touches, like I said, like I said with the Haram too. Like I'm not sure I'd agree with him that I'd rather the Russian oppression, but the challenge of like the sort of phenomenon of like the challenge of loneliness and meaning, etc., in a country where individual freedom has shattered community in many ways, right? And so, and we've lost a lot. On like the textual level, we talked about Judaism has lost a big piece of its tradition when it no longer has the opportunity to speak to larger parts of life. So I have no conclusions here.
Is there the insinuation of fake friendliness, or just genuine friendliness in a state of non-persecution kind of?
It could be genuine, but at the end of the day, it causes us to lose identity. Because there's so many other possibilities and influences around.
You need assimilation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But at the
Assimilation.
same time,
Yeah.
being in this country, we're free to be.
Oh, it's
authentic
beautiful.
Jewish.
I am
So
extremely
you gotta get
thankful.
both
Yeah,
sides of it.
1,000%. There's always double-edged swords in everything.
And then, isn't it true, like in the religious communities, really religious, you have to ask the rabbi for every little thing, instead of